Hi, and welcome to the Knitting Skills Proficiency tutorial on 1x1 ribbing in the round. Are you tired of having socks that fall down on your ankle because the elasticity in your 1x1 ribbing isn't as tight as you would like it? Or are you tired of having an inconsistent, kind of loose-looking stitch on the 1x1 ribbing that you knit? We're going to show you ways of tightening that up, both the elasticity and the uniformity of your stitches in such a way that you can actually fix two problems in one. We're going to show you one way of doing what's sometimes called Eastern Continental ribbing and sometimes called combination ribbing. Both of the two things have similarities to those, but we're going to show you a little bit about how to do each one in the round specifically. So let's get right to it, and then I'll talk about some of the benefits of it afterwards.
So two things. If you'd like to knit along while you watch the tutorial, you may want to pause the video at this point and actually cast on a little tube of in the round knitting. This is just 34 stitches of plain stockinette tube done on double pointed needles, and then you also might want to bring up the actual stitch pattern in the description of the video or print it off from my blog at queerjoe.com. So in the first setup round, we're going to do the setup round, and then we're going to do the one of the regular standard rounds of combination 1x1 ribbing in the round after that. In the first setup round, you're going to need to understand two different abbreviations that you might not have seen before in your knitting. The first one is KCW, which is knit clockwise wrap, and the second one is PCW, which is purl clockwise wrap. So a knit, typically when you're knitting, most people insert their needle in front of that leg to the back of their stitch, and then they wrap counterclockwise around that needle. They either pick it or they wrap it, and then they pull it through. KCW, you're going to insert your needle just the same way, except you're going to wrap it clockwise around the needle, the opposite, and pull that through. Similarly, a purl, most people insert through the front of the stitch and then wrap counterclockwise. We're going to wrap clockwise. So a purl clockwise wrap is that. That's all it is. So this is the setup round only. Oops. We're going to knit clockwise wrap, purl clockwise wrap. So one of the things see, my hand doesn't do it very automatically yet either. It takes a little while sometimes to get the muscle memory to work in such a way that that clockwise wrap comes naturally, but it does after a while. So when you're doing a clockwise wrap, it does two separate things at the same time. One is it uses slightly less yarn to go around your needle than a standard counterclockwise wrap. I know that sounds odd, but it actually doesn't go completely around the needle, whereas a counterclockwise wrap does. And so it's a small amount of difference, but that small amount of difference makes for a different tightness of that stitch, and the tightness of that stitch actually draws in looseness from surrounding stitches in such a way that it creates a tighter stitch for you. The other thing it does is it orientates the legs of your stitches in a twisted fashion. So instead of having a standard V-shape legs on your needles like you would for a knit stitch or the reverse of a purl stitch, it actually twists those stitches in such a way that they're overlapping on top of each other, which we're going to undo in the next round in the standard rounds. Did I do that? Clockwise, good. So I'm going to go through and finish the 34 stitches, hopefully wrapping all of them clockwise. You may have noticed that I might have screwed up one or two of these. it's not going to matter for the swatch. But it does take a little bit of practice to get to the place where my hand automatically wraps in a clockwise motion. But after a while, just like any other knitting stitch, the muscle memory kicks in, and I'm able to clockwise wrap like a pro, and you will too. Okay, so as we come to the end of the first setup row, this is the only time you will do the KCW and the PCW. On every other row in combination ribbing, you're going to do a KTBLCW or a PTBLCW, which is knit to back of loop, clockwise wrap, or purl to back of loop, clockwise wrap. And the reason we're doing that is, so you'll notice that this first knit stitch, the leg of this stitch should normally be in front, and this one should be in back. And so we're going to need to reorient that stitch. And the way we do that is we knit to the back of the loop. But again, it's knit to KTBLCW, which is knit to the back of the loop, clockwise wrap. And so we'll continue to clockwise wrap that. And on the purl stitch, we purl to the back of the loop by picking up the back leg of the purl stitch and clockwise wrap that as well. So PTBLCW is purl to back of loop, clockwise wrap. And we continue around the same way, knit to the back of the loop, clockwise wrap, purl to the back of the loop, clockwise wrap. I'll do that a little slowly here. So knit to the back of the loop, clockwise wrap, purl to the back of the loop, clockwise wrap. Okay? Knit to the back of the loop, clockwise wrap, purl to the back of the loop, clockwise wrap. And again, after a while, it starts to become pretty simple, and your muscle memory will kick in, and you'll start to do it automatically. In fact, when you switch back to it, it might cause some problems. But what it does do is this secondary row it's untwisting that initial twisted stitch by clockwise wrapping all our stitches, but it also continuously uses a shorter wrap around your needle in such a way that your stitches look the same because you're untwisting the prior row and twisting the current row with a shorter wrap each time, so you have tighter stitches. And I'll show you what that looks like. So I did this comparative swatch. This section is standard 1x1 ribbing. Now, let's see if I can give you a little bit of a close-up. One of the things is you'll notice that you can only see the knit stitches because until you stretch it out, and then you see the purl furrow columns of stitches. But when you're looking at just the knit stitches, some of the things that you'll see is an inconsistency in the height and the width of the stitch. Some look a little stretched out, like this one looks a little stretched out and less even, and also the elasticity of it, when you stretch it out from an elasticity perspective, it doesn't actually pull back completely. It actually stays somewhat stretched out. And the more you wear something like this as a sock, for instance, it will stretch out and stay stretched out and then no longer have the elasticity and actually fall down on your leg. Now this next, I'm going to skip this section. This next section is what we just gave you the tutorial on. It's combination knitting and purling in a 1x1 in the round ribbing. So it basically shows a much more even stitch. So the stitches that you can see, the public facing knit stitch columns, are much more even and don't have as much variation in terms of the height or the width. And the reason being is because the purl furrow rows and the shorter wraps on the knit rows give it a tighter pull in. There's less yarn used in making the stitch, so it's a tighter stitch and makes that that come out that way. You'll also notice that the elasticity of it stays in place more. It actually pulls back in much more tightly and keeps that way. It actually keeps the elasticity memory much better. One of the things that I tried is only doing a clockwise wrap on my purls. So my knit stitches on this one are all the same as they always are, but my purl stitches are actually combination purl stitches only, and it's actually a very good ribbing. It's more uniform than my standard 1x1, and it has a lot of memory as well. I ended up using that for a sock I recently did, and the sock itself came out in a really nice way. The stitches are even, the elasticity is strong, and I've worn this sock for a few hours already just to see whether the elasticity would come back, and it does come back. It has a lot more elasticity memory than standard 1x1 ribbing. Finally, I experimented with one other way of doing this, and this one I don't like very much, but basically it's the exact same combination ribbing that I showed in the tutorial, but I didn't untwist the purl stitch. I left the purl stitch twisted. And so it's even tighter and more dense. So if I turn this inside out, the purl stitch, which now shows up as the knit stitch in here, you can see it's actually very dense and tiny and twisted. Two problems I found with this. One is that it didn't actually help very much with the consistency of my stitching. It drew in my combination knit stitches on the public facing side of my work in a way that wasn't as consistent, I thought, as just standard combination ribbing with both the knit and purl stitches. But the other thing it did was it's extremely difficult to continuously twist your purl stitches. It's hard to actually insert your needle into a twisted stitch to keep it twisted. In fact, it's a lot easier to untwist it as you go along. So the one I suggest, the easiest one I suggest, is standard combination knitting and purling, where you're doing the, other than the setup row, you're doing the knit to back of loop clockwise wrap, KTBLCW, or purl to back of loop clockwise wrap, or PTBLCW. It seems to give the most consistency in the stitch look, and it also gives you an incredibly nice elasticity when it comes to memory of elasticity on things like a sock or even the band of a hat or things like that. So that's the one I recommend most, although this is the one I used on my sock and it seemed to work pretty well. So if you want to try an intermediate way of doing it, you can just combination purl and not combination knit your stitches. So I'll have all these stitch combinations: your standard knit one, purl one, your combination purling only in your 1x1 rib, your combination knitting and purling, and your combination knitting and twisted combination purling. So those are the 4 different ones that I did in this stitch. One of the other things you might want to consider as you're doing these is the gauge that you're getting with these. So if you take a look, this is a swatch of where I did 20 rounds in each of the different techniques. And the twisted one is approximately, it's a little less than 2 inches. The full combination knitting and purling is almost exactly 2 inches in a 20 round swatch. The only combination purling and regular knitting in the purl is also just about 2 inches. So the row gauge is about the same on both those combination ones, and my knit one, purl one is slightly over 2 inches. So the gauge does slightly change, and you can also notice that the width of these of this swatch, it's about 1 inch, 1.5 inches wide for the one that I did for my sock. It's slightly less than 1.5 for this one, so it does pull it in. However, on something like a sock, the elasticity of the negative ease of the elasticity of the 1x1 ribbing is actually something that you're going to find, I think, will compensate for that. So hopefully you'll enjoy this. Please feel free to leave any comments or questions in the description, the comments on YouTube or on my blog about ribbing. And hopefully you'll enjoy this as a new technique to add to your set of tools that you use to make really nice knitting. Thanks for joining us.